Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this month's town hall for the San Francisco District Attorney, Chesa Boudin. My name is David Campos. I am Chief of Staff of the San Francisco District Attorney's Office. This evening, we will be taking questions, as we always do every month, from San Franciscans from throughout the city. And these questions will go directly to DA Boudin. So let me begin by thanking all of you who are watching. And of course, by welcoming our district attorney, DA Boudin, welcome to our town hall.
Thanks so much, David. Really looking forward to hearing from our residents and our constituents and our community, and also getting a chance to answer as many of their questions as possible. And hopefully in the near term, being able to do one of these events in person. Thanks for coming. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, DA. And of course, we're still in the middle of a pandemic, and I know that the city is rolling out vaccines, but hopefully everyone's being safe and taking care of themselves. So we'll get right into it. And as we have noted before, we get these pre-submitted questions in advance of the town hall, but we also take questions that we get as we proceed with the town hall, questions that are asked in the chat. And finally, we're not going to be able to get to everyone's question, but we always do our best to make sure that we follow up. So let's get to it. And we're going to begin with one of our pre-submitted questions. And this is a question from Laura. So DA Boudin, Laura wants to know about the different roles that different agencies have in law enforcement. She says that people seem to be thinking that you're actually responsible for a perceived surge in crime, and so she's asking if the is the DA responsible for making the laws, for making arrests. Then she's asking what happens when an arrest is made, whether that has changed during COVID. And what does the DA do when an arrest is made? What happens when someone's on probation, on parole? What might a case be referred to in terms of an agency? So a lot of questions about how the system works, so maybe you can address that, DA.
Great. Well, thank you for that question, Laura. Obviously a lot to unpack there, but also really critical information for folks who are trying to understand what happens day in, day out in the criminal justice system and amongst all of us in city and local and state government who are working around the clock to promote public safety. So let me start at a really high level. The laws are written by the state legislature, or in some cases by the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. But most of the laws, when it comes to criminal violations, most of the laws are written by the state legislature, signed by the governor, and then in essence enforced at the local level. So let me walk you through a kind of hypothetical of how a crime gets processed from beginning to end. So let's take something like a burglary. If the legislature has written a law that makes it a crime to commit a burglary, and that law specifies different kinds of burglaries. It specifies the range of punishments that are available after someone has been convicted of a burglary. So that all comes to us from the state legislature. And then at the local level, if someone commits a burglary, we don't even know about it. We have no way of knowing about it in my office, in the district attorney's office, until a number of things happen. So the first step after a crime like burglary is committed is somebody has to report it. They have to call 911, or if it's no longer a crime in progress, then they have to report it to one of the non-emergency police phone numbers. And the reason for that is that the San Francisco Police Department is the primary investigating law enforcement agency in San Francisco. It's about 10 times the size of the district attorney's office because the police have a really different job than we do. Their job is to respond to crimes in progress, to investigate, to take witness statements, to gather evidence, and to write reports. Now, when people report a crime and the police respond and they investigate, in some ways it's a little bit like Law and Order, if you've seen that show where the first 3/4 of the show are the crime, the police investigation, and if all goes well in their investigation and they're able to identify the person that they believe committed the crime, then they'll make an arrest And only after that arrest is done and the investigation is completed do they present the case to the district attorney's office. That's when we get involved. And let me just make clear, in all of the cases where, for whatever reason, the police are unable to solve a crime, where they're unable to identify the suspect or gather enough evidence to make an arrest, we don't even get notified about it unless it's in the news. We have no way of knowing or seeing that a police report was even written or initiated. In the cases they do present to us, when they have completed an investigation, we have a team of lawyers that review the police investigation. And we have a very, very short time window to do it. Usually it's just 48 hours after an arrest. And during that time, we consider whether there's enough evidence for us to file a new criminal charge. And the legal standard for us is higher. It's a steeper burden for us to prove a charge is true than it is for the police to simply make an arrest. That's how the legal system is set up. The police can make an arrest with a relatively low amount of evidence, and we then review it to see if there's enough evidence to actually prove beyond a reasonable doubt that specific crimes were committed by the person who was arrested. Every day, the police bring us dozens of cases, and our lawyers review those cases. And in most of them, in the majority of cases, police bring us. The vast majority in certain categories of cases like homicide, for example, or armed robbery, for example. In the vast majority, we file new criminal charges. In some cases, we ask the police to go back and do more investigation. We tell them, for example, that we need DNA evidence or we need additional witness statements. And we ask them to bring it back to us with that additional investigation. Now, the question also asked about probation and parole. So let me briefly mention those. Our job, once we file charges, in those cases where we believe we can prove the charges to a jury, is to bring the evidence to the court or to the jury to litigate the case, to do the legal work of actually moving that case that we filed through the court system. And the judges make rulings. Sometimes they rule that evidence is inadmissible, or sometimes they dismiss charges if they don't think we have enough proof. Judges ultimately are the ones who make the decision about whether someone is in jail or not. There was a Chronicle article a couple of weeks ago that made a really important and really common misstatement and misunderstanding about the roles of these different actors. So the article in the San Francisco Chronicle said that I or my office release people who are arrested for certain kinds of crimes immediately. And that fundamentally misunderstands the role of the different agencies. So my office can make recommendations to the court about whether someone should be in jail pending trial or whether they should be released on conditions. But at the end of the day, in every single case, it is the judge who makes that decision. Is someone in jail? Is someone released? And the judge sometimes agrees with my office and sometimes does not. Now, at the end of the case, whether the person accused agrees to plead guilty, take responsibility for what they're charged with, or whether in a normal year, not like COVID, where the courts are mostly shut down, the case goes to trial. If the person is convicted, then we make a recommendation to the judge about a sentence. And again, it's up to the judge, not up to me or my office, what the ultimate outcome of the sentence will be. The judge has a range of discretion within the law that's written by the legislature, and they can impose any one of a number of sentences within that range. In many instances, when a person is released from jail or after a prison sentence, in fact, in most instances, they're released on some kind of supervision. Pre-trial, they're released usually on supervision of pretrial diversion, which is a San Francisco-based nonprofit. After conviction, they're either on probation, which is the adult probation department, or in some cases on parole, which is run by the State Department of Corrections. Now, the Division of Parole and the Adult Probation Department are two separate law enforcement agencies that my office doesn't control, but we work with them every day. And when someone who's on probation or parole is arrested, if it's a nonviolent or low-level offense, we will often refer that arrest to the probation or parole agent. They have a range of tools and powers that we don't have, and it's a far lower burden of proof to revoke someone or hold them in jail or impose other conditions or punishments if they are already on probation or parole than it is for us to prove a new criminal charge. So from a resource management standpoint and from an efficiency standpoint, in San Francisco as across the state, district attorneys will often refer low-level arrests, nonviolent arrests, to a supervising law enforcement agency. And that's been true for really for decades because of the need to use resources efficiently and to defer to other agencies that may have more information or better tools to intervene when someone's engaging in criminal conduct. Now, we could talk a lot more about this, but I want to be respectful of the fact that we have other questions.
Sure. So, District Attorney, we're going to take another pre-submitted question, and this one is from Jeff, and I have to say that I certainly have a personal interest in this. You know, I'm married to a Korean American man, and many folks in the Asian community have asked about recent attacks on members of the Asian community, and Jeff is asking, why are so few of these attacks being charged as hate crimes, according to him, when the victims are clearly being targeted due to their race?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question and for your concern about the Asian community. This is an issue that we are seeing in San Francisco and across the country. We know that there is a rise in racism, in hate speech, in discrimination, and we know that the AAPI community feels under attack. And I want to be very clear. I denounce any violence against members of the AAPI community, and I condemn attacks on elderly or vulnerable members of our community. Your question is specifically about hate crimes, and I want to be sure we clarify how the law works around hate crimes. Our office has a dedicated full-time assistant district attorney who focuses on prosecuting hate crimes. She has capacity to prosecute more cases. She has led over a dozen trainings with community groups on hate crimes and hate speech. And one of the reasons that we've done so many trainings, and I've participated in them myself, is because we know we need to do a better job preventing and educating and deterring. The other reason is because there's a tremendous amount of misinformation and confusion about what constitutes a hate crime. Now, not all hate speech or discrimination is a hate crime. In fact, the First Amendment protects a lot of hateful speech. Not all crimes that target protected groups are hate crimes. Sometimes you have hate speech, which is not a crime, and sometimes you have crimes which target vulnerable members of the community, which are crimes but not hate crimes. And to put the two together, to have a hate crime, what we need is a crime like vandalism or robbery or assault. And in addition to the evidence to prove that crime, we need evidence that the police bring us that the motivation for the crime was based on the identity of the victim. In other words, someone was queer, or someone was Asian, or someone was a woman, or someone was an immigrant. If we can prove beyond any reasonable doubt, if we can eliminate any alternative plausible explanation for why the victim was attacked or robbed or vandalized or whatever the underlying criminal act is, other than their identity, then we can charge a hate crime. But in any case where we can't prove what motivated the crime, or where there's multiple possible explanations for what motivated the crime, then we simply prosecute the crime, the robbery, the assault, the murder, whatever it is that's the underlying criminal act, and we do not and cannot legally use a hate crime enhancement. Now, I also want to be clear that in really serious cases, like murder, for example, adding a hate crime allegation increases the burden of proof, the amount of evidence that the police and my office would have to bring and show to a jury. But it does not and cannot increase the possible punishment. And so in many cases where we see members of vulnerable communities, where we see Asian Americans being targeted for crime, we don't have any evidence whatsoever about what motivated the defendant or the suspect to target that individual. In other words, a robbery or an assault can happen for lots of reasons. If we have a robbery or an assault where the suspect uses a racial slur or has a history of only robbing and assaulting people of that same community, or if we have messages on social media or text messages that express hatred and discriminatory ideas about a particular group, that is the kind of evidence we need to be able to prove a hate crime. When we have that evidence, we can and we will and we do charge hate crimes. But when we do not, what we do instead is we prosecute the underlying crime. And that's, for example, in the case that I know has been in the news a lot lately, the tragic and heinous killing of an 84-year-old Thai man, Visha Ratanapakdee. When he was killed, we charged that case as murder. It's the most serious law on the books. We do not have evidence about what motivated the heinous attack. And so we charged the underlying act, which is murder, which does not require us to prove motive or racial animus, but still allows us to hold someone accountable, to punish them, and to treat this crime with the severity that it deserves.
District Attorney, the next question is from Alvin, and he's asking about the crime wave in San Francisco, and specifically about the elderly Thai man that was murdered, who was brutally slammed to the ground and died, and mentions that it is just one of many violent attacks against the elderly. And Alvin is asking, what is the DA's office doing to protect elderly Asian Americans and all San Franciscans?
Yeah, that case that you mentioned, Alvin, is such a terrible case. The video is so devastating. And I meet with victims, the victims of homicides families on a regular basis. It's a critical part of my job. And I know that those meetings are with me every day as I make difficult decisions about what we'll do in each case my office handles. In the case you mentioned, the case of Visha Ratanapakdee, we have filed the most serious criminal charges in the books, murder. The defendant is being held in jail, detained at our request, pending trial. And my heart breaks every time I think about the suffering and the pain that his family is going through, both here in San Francisco and back in his home of Thailand. My office are continuing to collaborate with justice partners in law enforcement, as well as with AAPI community leaders, to take steps to do whatever we can to keep the AAPI community safe. Tomorrow, for example, we have a meeting with the Coalition of Safety and Community Justice, which includes a range of nonprofit groups that serve Chinatown and the AAPI community. We look forward to ideas and feedback from our community partners about what more we can do to protect vulnerable members of the community. I also appear bi-monthly on Singtown Radio to answer questions from listeners, to share initiatives from our office, and to help provide information and dispel confusion about what our office is doing and what we can do going forward. We are more than happy to take other suggestions and other ideas from people who have ways we can do more. We're looking for ways we can do more. But I also want to be really clear about something you mentioned in your question. You mentioned a crime wave. Now, it is true, of course, that there have been a few high-profile, brutal attacks, and that in some of those, the victims have been Asian. We're talking about a couple cases already in the earlier questions, about one case in particular, Ratanapakdee, and there's others. We've all seen the videos. These cases, of course, cause fear and panic. They make people feel unsafe. And we are doing everything in our power to change that, but information is also power. And I want to assure you that crime is not rising, that the number of cases police are bringing us that are classified by police as hate crimes are not rising in any significant numbers, and that we are continuing to take all the steps in our power to hold people who commit crimes accountable.
District Attorney, we're going to take a question from the chat, and this is actually from Kenny. This is what he says. I actually want to take one question. And this is what he said about a statement you made. How can you dismiss the attack on Visha as a temper tantrum? Doesn't that just encourage more attacks since there's no consequence?
Kenny, I want to be really clear. I have never said that the attack on Mr. Ratanapakdee was a temper tantrum. Never said that. I was being asked by the New York Times for an important article covering the rise of attacks and discrimination against members of the Asian community, an article I wanted to contribute to and express my solidarity with the Asian community in. I was asked about the context for the case, and I was asked about why we had not charged it as a hate crime. And I explained, as I did a few moments ago, that we have no evidence of what motivated this particular attack. We don't know why the attack occurred. And in context, I was describing something that occurred prior to the attack, where the defendant appears to be hitting a parked car. And I used the words temper tantrum in regard to what the defendant was doing to the car prior to the attack on Mr. Visha Ratanapakdee. And I want to be very clear, there is no more serious charge than murder. It carries the possibility of life in prison. Whatever words I used, whatever your words may have in some cases been twisted and manipulated by other media outlets looking for clicks or to stir up controversy, I want to be very clear about what our actions, which speak louder than words, should communicate. We take this case very seriously, so seriously that we immediately charged it as murder and sought the detention of the defendant, even though he had no criminal history in San Francisco. Those are our actions. We have met with the family. We will continue to provide victim services to the family whenever and however those services are desired. Now, I understand that people are upset, and I understand that people are in fear and that they are looking for places to point the finger and blame. But nothing I said and nothing my office has done or will do in any way undermines the severe gravity of this case, of this crime, of this murder.
DA, we're going to go back to one of the pre-submitted questions. This is from Claire, and she's asking, how can we deter violent crime in San Francisco, and mentions her concern about the elderly and women walking their dog, those being targeted.
Well, first of all, we condemn these attacks. We have no tolerance in San Francisco for violence or for attacks that target vulnerable members of our community. We've talked a little bit already about that. It's also important to remember that these are challenges that are not unique to San Francisco. We saw a very high-profile recent attack, brutal attack, on the dog walker for Lady Gaga in Los Angeles. We know that violent crime, sadly, is a reality in every city in this country. And we are all doing our best to combat the scourge of violent crime. Now, as upsetting as these crimes are to the victims and to their families and to their neighbors and to all of us, we also need to be careful not to overstate how common they are, simply because of the availability of video footage. These days, many crimes occur on camera. And so through social media, through apps like Nextdoor and Citizen, many of us see crimes more often than we would have 5 or 10 years ago. But the statistics are really important to remember. The data is important to remember as we think about public safety and public policy. And we know from data that crime is actually down in violent crime categories, crimes like robbery and assault, the two most common violent crimes reported in San Francisco every year, are both down by double digits since I took office. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't have a lot of work to do. Of course, there are still robberies and assaults occurring. Of course, people are still in fear that they may be victimized. And as long as that is true, my office will have work to do, and we will continue to do that work. We take these cases seriously. And when police are able to solve them and bring us enough evidence, we are ecstatic to be able to do our job, to be able to file criminal charges and look at ways to hold people accountable who've caused harm, to deter them from doing it in the future, and to support victims who have been harmed.
So next we're going to go to the chat, and actually Corey asked a question that goes to a similar point that you made, and he's asking, can you explain the difference between how a large population of San Franciscans perceive a rise in crime, burglaries, robberies, being robbed on the street, the woman who was robbed and had her dog kidnapped, how do you, and then, the news that a reporter had their camera stolen at gunpoint. So how do you explain that perception versus the actual data? How can we reconcile the perceived crime versus the actual data?
Thanks for the question. There's a lot of different answers to it. And the truth is, criminologists, people who spend their whole careers studying crime and crime trends, have a lot of unanswered questions about what drives crime and perceptions of crime. But let me offer a couple of theories that I think are part of the answer. I don't know that they're the whole answer, because I don't think any of us know the whole answer. But one thing is that crime trends don't always move linearly, and they don't always move in sync. And what I mean by that is some categories of crime are up by a lot, like commercial and residential burglaries. Some other categories of crime are also up, like gun violence. And that's true across the country. We see it far worse in cities like Oakland and San Jose, where in Oakland, homicides are up by about 400% this year compared with the beginning of last year. So part of it is some crimes are up, and those are the ones that tend to get covered in the news, right? Because it is newsworthy when crimes are on the rise. It is newsworthy when there is a robbery of a news crew. By definition, that is going to make the news. And so we hear about those stories. It's what I think social scientists refer to as a availability heuristic. It's where, because we see lots of examples, or a selection bias, where we see lots of examples of high-profile crimes in the news, we believe that crime is going up. And in fact, that's been true for the last 20 years. As crime has fallen, polling data and public opinion data has shown that people believe crime is going up, because the news media will, of course, continue to cover crime that does occur. And there will always be some crime in big cities, and that crime will make it into the news, and people will read about it and believe that it is representative of the norm, even if it's exceptional and an outlier. That's a big part of it. I think the other part is just sort of the effect of the COVID pandemic. Even though crime is down, we have far fewer people coming into the city for work and for tourism. And we also have different kinds of crime that affect us, in some instances, much more personally, like residential burglaries, which are on the rise. And it's tremendously violating and fear-inducing to have someone attempt or actually break into your home or garage. So I think those crimes, the coverage around them, the fact that we're all cooped up and anxious about the pandemic, among a variety of other factors, account for the disconnect between data. And you can go to the police crime dashboard. Let me see if I can try to share it in the chat here. The police crime dashboard I've just shared shows you crime trends. It shows you based on what gets reported to the police. So you can see that this year, compared with the first 2 months of 2020, reported crime is actually down 20% overall. Now, some categories are down by a lot, like thefts and auto burglaries. That's down by about 50%. And other categories, like commercial and residential burglary, are up by a lot, by nearly 60%. So those changing crime patterns, I think, also have a big role in explaining the disconnect between the actual data and people's perception. But I'm really hopeful that as 2020 rolls on and as we reopen and go back towards pre-pandemic normal lives, that people will begin to feel safer and that the perception will catch up with the data.
DA, we're going to go to another pre-submitted question. So this question asks whether you're not being tough on people who are repeatedly committing crimes and whether you're not prosecuting them.
Thanks for the question. We actually got a really similar question about a week and a half ago from the Board of Supervisors Public Safety Committee. And so my team pulled 3 years worth of data from our office, the 2 years before I took office, and then my first year in office to look at exactly this question. And we found something really interesting, and it may surprise you, particularly given the way that some of the social media and news coverage of our office has suggested. What we found was that since I took office, we've actually increased the rate of filing new criminal cases against people who are arrested repeatedly. In other words, multiple times in San Francisco over a 3-year period. The specific number is 70%. We file 70% of, or I should say we file criminal charges in 70% of the cases police bring us someone who's been arrested repeatedly. Now that number is significantly higher than it was in 2019 or in 2018. It's another important thing to remember. In all 3 years we looked at, 18, 19, and 20, the majority, more than 50% of arrests that police brought to us to consider prosecuting were a first arrest in the last 3 years. In other words, most of what we deal with is not repeat arrests or recidivism. Most of what police bring us are people who have not been arrested in San Francisco in the last 3 years. There's a lot of misinformation out there suggesting that we don't consider someone's prior criminal history, that we don't prosecute cases, or that most crime in San Francisco is being driven by repeat arrestees. That is simply not true. It's not what the data shows. It's not what we're doing day in, day out. And there's no evidence whatsoever to suggest it, other than a few non-representative, outlier, cherry-picked cases that have been turned into high profile because of the real harm caused in those cases, but not because they're representative of what happened or what the data shows about our office. The truth is, since I took office, I've filed more than 4,500 new criminal cases. I'm under attack from the left, from the public defender's office, because they believe I'm being too aggressive in filing cases, including cases that involve drug sales, for example, of fentanyl and other drugs that have contributed to overdoses. Now, I know that we need to do more to provide the kind of monitoring and supervision and supports to ensure that when people are arrested and they are released pending trial or after a conviction, that they don't go on to reoffend. Recidivism is a reality everywhere in this country. More than 2/3 of people getting out of state prison all across the state will be reincarcerated within a couple of years. This is a statewide problem. We need more tools and more resources to ensure people being released from custody do not reoffend. And that's something we're working on every single day, and it is a big challenge that requires teamwork and collaboration with all of our partners in the community and in other law enforcement agencies as well.
District Attorney, we're going to go back to the chat where Joseph is asking the following question. Is it true that if someone robs a CVS or Walgreens, but the amount is below a certain dollar amount, that the DA will not charge them? And because of that, police know that and they will not arrest? Is that true?
That is not true. Let me set the record straight. First of all, robbery is a robbery regardless of the dollar amount at issue. If you rob a penny from someone, it is still a robbery. The $950 amount is only a relevant inquiry when we're talking about theft, like shoplifting. It is true that under state law that was made by the voters statewide and reaffirmed by the voters statewide in the last November election, that a theft under $950 cannot be prosecuted as a felony, only as a misdemeanor, but it can still be prosecuted. And when police solve those cases and bring them to our office, we do in fact prosecute those cases. We have a wide range of tools for prosecuting them. But here's part of the problem, and I want to share this again with folks. This is another police dashboard. It has a similar outline and layout. If you look at in the dashboard I just shared, if you look at the bottom category of crime, larceny theft, which includes auto burglaries as well as the kind of shoplifting that occurs all too often at retailers like Walgreens and CVS, you'll see that in 2021 so far, police are solving 3.4% of reported thefts. That's a big decline from last year, where they were solving 4.7%. But whether it's 3% or 4% or 5%, the vast majority of cases that a theft gets reported in, no one is arrested, no investigation is brought to my office to even consider prosecuting. Now, when we get those cases, in the 3% or 4% of cases that police bring us, most of the time we take action, whether it's a new criminal case, whether it's a diversionary program, whether it's a probation or parole violation, we take those cases seriously. So seriously, in fact, that my new community liaison program has been really proactive at developing protocols with some of these chain stores that are under real serious pressure from repeat thieves, repeat shoplifting, and in some cases, robberies, to develop protocol. And also, my investigators have gone ahead and written arrest warrants in a number of cases where we believe the same people are targeting stores over and over again. And we have enough evidence to prove who's doing it, what they're doing, where they did it. In other words, enough evidence to prove a case, even where the police haven't brought it to us, because they're spread thin and they have to prioritize serious and violent crimes. My investigators have written arrest warrants in a number of these cases, and we're working very closely with Walgreens, CVS, and other retailers in Union Square and beyond to make sure we're more responsive than has ever been true in the past. And I think you'll see there's an article in Mission Local about this issue that profiles some of the work that we're doing and that we hope to continue to do to make sure we stand up for the kinds of businesses that we know are anchors in our communities that provide medicine and basic necessities to people who otherwise would have to travel far out of the neighborhood to get them. Those businesses need our support, and they have it.
Now, DA Boudin, the next question is from Brian, and Brian wants to have more information on the recent Fentanyl Task Force that you announced. He wants to know what will the task force do, who is part of it, and how will it help to ease the death and drug use in San Francisco?
Great, and I want to address that. I just realized, one thing that I may not have made clear in my last answer. Let me just go back for a minute and make sure folks are familiar with the difference between robbery and theft. Robbery is basically a theft where the perpetrator uses force or fear. So if you think about, for example, a shoplifting or a pickpocket, that would be a theft. If you think about someone who either threatens to use physical force or brandishes a weapon or physically grabs and rips out of your hands property, that would be a robbery. Robbery under state law, as written by the state legislature, is a felony, is a strike, carries up to 5 years in prison. A theft, on the other hand, if it's under $950, is a misdemeanor. If it's over $950, then it could be either a misdemeanor or a felony. So those are just some background on the differences there. Now, the next question was about the Fentanyl Task Force. And this is something we presented on in our budget proposal. We had a public hearing on our budget, and we submitted it to the mayor and to City Hall. The fact of the matter is, we have seen more deaths from drug overdoses in San Francisco in 2020 than from COVID-19. We saw the kind of amazing unified response from every agency in the city in the face of COVID-19. We saw how every single partner in city government stepped up and played a role to address the crisis. And meanwhile, more people died from drug overdoses. The Fentanyl Task Force is really about me and my office trying to step up and play a leadership role in addressing this devastating humanitarian crisis. Now, we cannot simply continue doing the same things that have been done in the war on drugs and in the response to the absolute devastation that we see playing out every day on the streets of the Tenderloin and Soma and parts of the Mission. We can't keep doing the same thing and expect a different outcome. So this task force is designed to take a very different approach than has been done in the past by thinking strategically, by engaging through multidisciplinary responses to this crisis, and to leading not with a lock them up and throw away the key mentality that has been so central to the war on drugs, but rather with a public health approach. And Supervisor Haney, who is the supervisor for the districts that are hit the hardest, and the neighborhoods that are hit the hardest by these overdoses, introduced a supplemental budget that would fund not just the task force within our office, but also critically far more money that would go to the needed public health approach. Now, we know that first and foremost, to save lives, we need safe consumption sites, and we need treatment on demand for people who are suffering from drug addiction. And to the extent we have a role as law enforcement, it cannot simply be to prosecute low-level street dealers who are brought to us in most of the cases that we are presented with by local law enforcement. We know that approach will simply not make a difference. It won't save lives. It won't disrupt the supply of drugs or the purity of drugs. It won't help people who are addicted get the support they need. And so this task force is going to include a lawyer who can help work on policy. It's going to include lawyers who can help supervise treatment for people who have substance use issues. It's going to include social workers who have the ability to do alternative sentencing planning for people who are caught up in whether it's human trafficking, whether it's repeat offenses for drug dealing, whether it's economic opportunity issues, whether it's access to other social services, sentencing planners who can get into the weeds with each individual who's being prosecuted and help us ensure that the way we hold people accountable when they violate the law changes their behavior instead of simply perpetuating a cycle or a revolving door. So our request of the city is not to grow the footprint of our office. I want to be really clear. If our request for a task force is funded and fully funded, it will simply bring us back to the staffing levels we had before I took office. In other words, it'll bring us back to square one in terms of our ability to meet the needs of the community. And it will allow us to hire staff who have training in language skills, in public health policy, in the kinds of things that we know are necessary to decrease the horrific carnage that is being caused on our streets, the deaths every single day that are piling up because of lethal and illegal drugs.
DA, another question on a similar topic, on the same topic from Glenn, another pre-submitted question. Glenn is asking about the open air drug dealing, drug selling that happens in San Francisco, and he wants to know, is that a felony?
Yes, short answer, selling drugs, selling illegal drugs or possessing illegal drugs with the intent to sell is a felony. My office prosecutes that conduct as a felony. And in fact, those felony cases make up a larger percentage of our caseload than any other single category of felony case. We file those cases at a higher rate than almost any other category of charge the police bring us. And yet, clearly it is not working. We need a new approach. We need a better approach. And I hope that our fentanyl task force will allow us to lead in saving lives and really changing the nature of what we see on our streets every day.
Great. Well, we're going to continue with our pre-submitted questions. And this is a question from Catherine. And she says, you know, it's hard to follow what has actually been accomplished, what has been done since you were elected. And she's asking if you can tell us about some of the things you have accomplished, whether it's campaign promises or anything else that you want to highlight in terms of your accomplishments since you took office.
Well, thanks for the question. You know, it's been a tough first year or so as a department head, as an elected official running the district attorney's office. We faced challenges that I never could have anticipated for all of us in our office and all of us in the community because of COVID. But despite that, I'm really proud of what we have accomplished. So let me talk about a few of the things that I committed to on the campaign trail that we have managed to deliver on. First of all, I promised that we would end money bail, and we did that my first month in office. We ended the practice of my office my attorneys ever asking the court to put a price tag on freedom. We replaced a wealth-based system of incarceration with a risk-based system. It promotes public safety and it promotes equality under the law. We've also followed through on promises around police accountability, not just from the standpoint of some of the laws and policies we put in place. Those are really important and we could spend a long time talking about them. But we also took concrete steps, historic steps. We filed 3 criminal cases against San Francisco Police Department officers who, while on duty, used force we believe and allege was unlawful against unarmed Black men. One of those cases just this week went through a preliminary hearing where a San Francisco judge ruled that we had enough evidence to take those charges to a jury. One of the other cases was the first ever filing of a homicide charge against a San Francisco Police Department officer who, while on duty, killed an unarmed Black man. That is hard work. It is slow work. It is work that has enraged the San Francisco Police Union and some of its apologists who insist on spreading misinformation and disinformation and attacking everything we do because of their desire to defend the indefensible, to insist on a status quo where Black lives don't matter, but we know that they do. And on my watch, they will, and they always will.
We have a...
Oh, let me just say 1 or 2 other things if I could, David. I know I'm going on for a long time. I am proud of the work the team's done, and I want to emphasize a few other things. We launched an innocence commission that I promised I would, and a resentencing unit that looks at doing justice retroactively as well as prospectively. We've increased our victim service resources, providing housing for domestic violence victims and sexual assault survivors. We also closed County Jail 4, a key campaign promise. In addition, we've avoided an outbreak in the jail during the COVID pandemic. We launched the Economic Crimes Against Workers unit that I promised we would. We've expanded toxicology testing so that when people come forward after being sexually assaulted, we have a better chance of gathering evidence needed to successfully prosecute those cases. We launched a small business pilot program to provide reimbursement and support to businesses being harmed by crime. And we launched a community liaison program so that every single district in this city has representatives from my office who they know and trust and work with to promote public safety. Those are just a few of the many things that I'm proud of my team, of my office, of the hardworking staff in the district attorney's office for accomplishing, even in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic.
We have a question from James, and James would like to know, how does restorative justice work when you don't actually know the perpetrators? You have victims, but you don't have perpetrators. What is the route of those victims for compensation? And James says, I agree with the tenets of restorative justice, but it seems very long-term, and to commit to long-term, we need a substantial amount of resources to help so-called casualties along the way.
Thank you so much for that question, James. You're absolutely right. Restorative justice is a long-term plan. It's something that we're working on expanding slowly and carefully. We have not made any major expansion of restorative justice work. And you know, the last question was about what I was proud of, what we'd accomplished. Restorative justice is something that we still have ahead of us. We haven't yet been able to significantly expand it, but I hope and I'm confident that in 2021, we will be able to do more. And for me, restorative justice is first and foremost about victims and putting crime victims at the center of the process. So what does that mean? It means, James, that in those cases where police have not been able to identify a suspect or where we don't have enough evidence to successfully prosecute a case using the traditional criminal court process, it means that the defendant, the person who caused the harm, cannot be involved in a restorative justice process. And so we can't do a traditional restorative justice approach. What we can do and what we will do in every case where we have the resources available is we can support crime victims, regardless of whether we're able to prosecute the person that harmed them. So I'll give you an example of what that means. It means that in District 5, in partnership with Supervisor Dean Preston, when small businesses are vandalized or have their windows broken, even if police do not make an arrest, even if no one ever notifies us that the crime occurred, those small businesses can now come forward and say, hey, I needed to fix my window. Here's what it cost. Can you help me? And we have a dedicated victim advocate who helps process those claims and ensure that those small victims get reimbursed. That's the kind of work we can do in property crime cases. We hope to expand it. The main central pillar of my budget proposal to the city this year is to significantly expand our victim witness division. We want more staff and more resources to support people who have been harmed by crime, regardless of whether police solve the case or we have the evidence to successfully convict.
Well, I know that we're running out of time, and I really want to thank everyone for giving us some great questions. So let me turn to a question that was presented by Catherine, and she wants to know, what are your top priorities for this next year, this current year?
Well, there's a lot ahead of us, and I think that really, first and foremost, I want to get the courts open again. I want to get my staff back in the office and in the courtrooms safely, and I want to be able to move forward in clearing a massive backlog of cases. Crime victims and witnesses and investigators have been waiting for far too long to have their day in court. And I know there are many people we are prosecuting who are accused of crimes, who have asserted their right to speedy trial, and who have not been able to get in front of a jury because of COVID. So first and foremost, I want to make sure that we as a city can reopen and reopen safely together. There's going to be a lot of work. There's going to be a lot of transitions. I know there will be changes in crime and in policing and in the work that my lawyers do day in, day out. And I hope we can do that effectively and efficiently, and most of all, safely.
Well, thank you, DA, for your answers, and to all the folks who have been participating in our town hall, we really appreciate it. We tried to get through as many questions as we possibly could, and so we want to thank you for attending our March town hall. If we did not get to your question, we ask you to please email us, and we'll make sure to get a response to you. The email is districtattorney@sfgov.org. districtattorney@sfgov.org. And we have weekly Facebook Lives, Wednesdays at noon, where you can watch the DA live talking about different parts of the work of the office. And of course, we have our monthly meetings. And the other thing that I want to highlight is what the DA mentioned about our community liaisons. We have in every district personnel from the district attorney's office assigned to those districts to work with every neighborhood group, every member of the community. So thank you for watching. Please be safe. Thank you again, San Francisco. See you next time.
Thank you so much. Thank you, David. Thank you all for coming. We appreciate you. Stay safe. We'll see you soon.